Let's talk about the span of the career. You know, this idea that if you love the early Genesis, you're not going to like the later Genesis because they're so entirely different. You know, the sense that you were this great sort of prog rock pioneering band, and then in came MTV and pop songs, and you sort of coasted on that and lost the original audience and gained a totally different audience that, of course, music critics don't respect. You know. What do you think?
Well, I think people get older. I think, you know, the music I liked best in my life was when I was between 13, 17, 18. Those are things which pretty much the Beatles kind of encompassed all that period, and all the English groups and all the Tamla Motown and Beach Boys, all the stuff in America. And I think that stays with you, and you never kind of get over that, really. So if you have a long career like Genesis has, your different eras are going to appeal to different people. And I think we did feel at a certain point we were starting to repeat ourselves. We had all the reprises of bits and pieces that had gone before and all the rest of it. And I think it was probably the solo albums that changed everything more than anything else, actually. You didn't have the same feeling you had to put everything in. So you didn't end up with these sort of 20-minute songs with bits from everybody in. You ended up with slightly more concise stuff.
Duke, actually, is a fascinating album, I think, because it's got the long stuff, but we talk about the long stuff in shorthand, but I mean, interesting musically, and then interspersed with that are the short songs, which might be called the Phil Collins songs. Do you want to talk about Duke a bit?
Well, I don't think you can call it the Phil Collins songs. You know, I mean, Phil wrote 2 songs on that album on his own, which were Please Don't Ask and Misunderstanding, but everything else was obviously group written. And particularly sort of Turn It On Again very much came from Mike and I, as it happens. And I sort of think that's what Genesis always does quite well, is sort of like, it kind of crystallises, you know, you've got the sort of things happening, not quite sure what's going to happen, and suddenly this quite positive thing sort of comes out in the middle of it all. And, you know, Duchess was very much a sort of thing we wrote in the studio, that all of us there, if you like. And Phil had the drum machine part, and I had this sort of keyboard thing going. And then I obviously wrote a lyric for it and everything afterwards. And I think it encapsulates everything, you know, that's sort of good about Genesis, the sort of, without being too complicated. And that thing's very interesting. And, you know, some of the other songs, there's a couple of, I mean, I don't think it's good all the way through. I don't think Mike's contribution was quite as good on that album as some. Not a great fan of Alone Again Tonight, or whatever we called it in the end, I have to say. But I think some of the other stuff on that album is tremendous. And the way it starts is just so sort of, you know, positive.
Do you think it's right to see Duke as a kind of turning point, but also maybe one of the best examples of Genesis's work, in the sense that you've kind of learnt so much in the way you develop songs, so you have got those long tracks that work really well, and then you're kind of shifting into a new gear as well.
Well, it turned out like that. I don't think we really realised it at the time, in a way. I think it was combinations of various things. I think it was the solo albums made the big difference. I mean, by that stage, by the time we got to the end of, started doing Abacab, you know, all 3 of us had by that time done solo albums. And I think just changed the way we approached it a little bit. And we all felt, I think, that things like Turn It On Again and Duchess and Behind the Lines, which are sort of very much group-written tracks, were the sort of the standout points on Duke. And we wanted to carry on with that a little bit. And, you know, I think on Abacab, you could argue we went too far, I think. You know, sometimes it's sort of, you know, we still had the one individual track from each of us. But then some of the group tracks were just a bit more sparser, you know, and I thought we needed a bit of that streamlining to happen. But then by the time we got to the next album, the sort of Genesis album, as it were, you know, we'd sort of expanded out again a little bit, and I think that's a superior album.
As we're on this now, Hugh Padgham came in with Abacab, made a difference to the way you sounded. I mean, I think Mike
he was very important, I think. I mean, we'd heard, the first we heard of when we played the backing track, or at least the drum part, to what became The Intruder on Peter's album, which Phil had played, and he just said, listen to this, it's fantastic. And it was just an incredible sound, you know. And I think from that moment on, Phil knew he wanted to use Hugh, who was the engineer on that, as for his own record. And it just seemed logical for us to change. We you know, we'd had a great time with Dave Henschel and everything, but we just felt we wanted to move on to a sort of, change. You don't have to stick with people, and Hugh seemed like an interesting choice for us, so that's kind of went there. And he was incredibly good with drums, I think, Hugh, and good with voice as well. Perhaps not quite so good with the middle instruments, but Mike and I felt very capable of, being in control of that area. And the result was, I think particularly when we sort of with the two albums after that, Genesis and Invisible Touch, we really sort of had a great way of working with Hugh, which worked really well, and it was good fun.
Mike said, I think that Abacab was the first album that sounded, like you would sound live.
Yeah, I know he does. He says that, doesn't he? I don't know that it's necessarily true. I think it possibly, when we did the remixes, which are, Nick Davis, who was the sort of later producer that we used, engineer, and I did sort of work with him quite closely on all those remixes. Some of those early things, once you actually got inside the tracks and could do them, properly, you could really get a good sound out of them and everything. I think particularly things like The Lamb, we managed to make sound a lot better than it had done before. It's just, I think it was perhaps because we always went in the studio, without having played the tracks live and everything. So it just sometimes, some of the tracks improved a great deal live. I mean, like a song like In the Cage, for example, which on the album Lamb is not a standout track, but became one of our standout tracks live just because we developed it and all sorts of things happened with it. So it's difficult to compare the live version of that, say, with the studio version of that. But with many of the other songs, I think, you go back to those original tapes, and what's on there is pretty good.
Okay, so this has no logical sequence here, but just picking up on In the Cage, it just occurs to me you performed Lamb Lies Down 100 times live. I mean, all over the...
In its entirety.
Yeah, in its
probably,
entirety.
It wasn't quite, but probably not far off that, yeah.
That sort of stint must have changed your feeling for it, the way you played it. There must have been lots of things that you picked up on the way that might have made a difference.
Well, I suppose so. You kind of, when we're very much we're a writing unit, so we tend to write music, and then when we're performing what we've written. So things don't change all that much. There were various improvised sections on The Lamb, the little bits and pieces, which in many ways are some of the favourite bits on there, whether they were sort of quite big pieces like Fly on a Windshield, where we would do what we wanted, which, I think is one of the best moments on the record. And then other little tinkly moments, like Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats. These things just had a lot of character, and they were improvised. But when we played the other songs, they stayed fairly much the same. And, you didn't do too much with them. I don't think even when we played Cage live at that point, for example, it was as good as it later became. We made it much more of a rock song, I think, after that, and it was, it sounded a lot better.
Because you were playing it in stadium shows in the 80s.
Well, we played it throughout our career. We sort of never kind of could lose it. It just became, I think, a sort of a really strong moment from there. I mean, when we'd finished The Lamb, it was my decision. I really wanted to do that song live because I felt it was much better than it had ever been. So when we started doing, when after Peter left, it seemed a logical song to go back to. I just thought it had such a strong power to it, and it'd be a great song to take out of context. I mean, we could have taken that. We could have chosen Back in New York City, but that depended a bit more on Pete's vocal performance. I wanted just a good, really sort of rock song, and try and get rid of the sort of troubles. Everything associated with The Lamb became a little bit kind of arty-farty in a way because of the lyric. It tended to make it a certain sort of thing, and you could sort of take something out of context, like In the Cage, and you pretty much could get away with it if people didn't listen too close to the lyrics. Quite sure what's going on in the middle with Brother John and all that, but it just sort of sounded really good, and these sort of words like stalagmite, there's just a lot of power in there, I think.
The kind of emotion that you find in Genesis in the earlier years is very much associated with, I guess, the pacing, Peter's voice, but your sound. As I was coming here, I was listening to Supper's Ready, and there's an extraordinary sort of flow of different emotions going through that. To what extent was all that just accidental? To what extent was it calculated
Well, I think
and worked out?
there's a bit of luck in it, but we like to play with contrast. I probably was most into this idea. I was always trying to sort of steer away a little bit from just doing straight ahead, pop songs. I think we all were to some extent, but perhaps I was the one who kind of wanted to carry it the furthest. And, the idea of linking a quiet bit to a loud bit to try and make the loud bit sound louder than it did if it was, on its own. And then we had, and Supper's Ready was an interesting one, really, because the first part sort of thing I'd written on guitar, and, we're developing it, and it was turning very much into a sort of musical box part 2. And at a certain point, I just thought, Peter had written this song called Willow Farm, totally independent of everything else. I said, we'd just done this very pretty little bit, and I thought, well, it would be just great to go into that bit suddenly, without any kind of real reason or anything. And the contrast made it sound really great, I think, because it made Willow Farm sound even more insane and kind of, distinctive than it actually was. And it's a great piece of music, and you stuck it in the middle of that, and that totally transformed the song after that, because from then on, we were sort of very much into, we were into playing, all of us playing, I was on keyboards obviously by then and everything, and the whole thing took on a much grander level, and we were able to make much more of it. And, particularly the kind of Apocalypse in 9/8 section, which, was so we left it as when we were actually during the writing stage, it was fairly free, and then it was probably the first time that Mike, Phil, and I very much worked together on something, and we sort of wrote that whole bit. As a keyboard solo, but with the sort of the basis from what the other two were doing, and then developing into these really big chords at the end, which when I originally wrote those things, I originally saw it as an instrumental piece, and then Pete started singing on top of it, which initially sort of was what's he doing? And then, of course, it just sounded so fantastic, It just gave you a sort of somewhere to build to, I suppose. And a lot of it was luck. And things, and some great imagery from Pete's lyrics on that.
Did you do these things in sections? When you said you Mike and Phil worked on that piece, was it like a separate section which you were then you knew where it was going to go, and did you stitch it all together? Yeah,
pretty much. We knew where it was going to start and where it's going to end. We'd sort of come into this idea, and it just sort of. I suppose I can't really remember exactly how I did it. Probably went into some sort of rhythmic thing with the opening chords of that, with the Guards of Magog bit, and then we needed to get somewhere at the end of it. I honestly can't remember everything, but all I know is that we left it fairly free, and then developing it quite late on in the game, and we were sort of still kind of putting it all together when we finally got in the studio, I suppose, with that. And as was said before, I mean, it was the first time I'd heard it all the way through. Although we'd played it all the way through, to be honest. We didn't hear it back till we edited the two bits together, and then found that actually the two bits were slightly out of tune with each other, which was an interesting moment for Mike and I. We were in another studio, and we had to sort of slow the tape down slightly to get the two in. It sounds very peculiar, but everyone thought, oh, that's really sort of artistic, But as it turned out, in fact, what was the strange thing was when Nick and I came back to doing the remix of this, we found that the two bits were actually in the same key. There was no problem. What the problem was with the machines in the studio. We'd done the edit. One of the machines was running slow. So there you go. That's how it turned out. So we didn't have to do this slow down thing. Because obviously nowadays we could have put them in the same key without any problem anyhow, with modern electronics. But it was just that. Anyhow, it's a little moment, really.
The thing about Supper's Ready, it strikes me, because it's worth focusing on it for a minute, because it's one of the kind of big classic numbers from Genesis's first period, very popular still. It's the sort of banality of somebody saying supper's ready, and then the mystery of the language that surrounds it, coupled with this extraordinary musical feel, the atmosphere which you're giving it. I mean, I think that's one of the attractions of it. It's one of those things that one can puzzle about for many a year, as indeed some people have,
Well, I think in terms of when Pete suggested calling it Supper's Ready, I think I said, no, we've got to call it something else, something more epic. But actually it was great, because what it did was it made it sort of sound like a throwaway title for something that was so long and ambitious, and obviously sort of vaguely related to the lyric. certainly of the first bit, you know. And all the individual titles in it all the way through a little bit, perhaps a little bit too clever, some of them, but it was sort of gave it it's part of the character of the piece. And I think it's, you know, happens to be the longest, but it probably is the sort of standout of the early period with Peter, I suppose. That, you know, I mean, some people would 2 or 3 other songs that might be up there, like Musical Box or perhaps Further Fifth, perhaps Cinema Show, you know, but Supper's Ready is very much, I think it's my favourite from that period, definitely.
Going back to the sort of early stages when you guys were starting up, I'm just wondering where this was coming from. The kind of you're sort of drawing on a little bit on folk music, but you're also very keen on pop and rock, and you're trying to do something a bit different with the sound, aiming for a different sound, even early on, even with the Genesis to Revelation stuff. Am I right?
Well, yes, I'm not quite so sure with the Genesis Revelation really whether we were trying quite so much to do other things. I think what we felt was that we loved all this music we'd been brought up with and everything, but the idea of taking it a little bit further, which had been suggested, you know, to some extent by groups, you know, obviously like Procol Harum, I suppose, with the Shine On Brightly album, and groups like Family and Fairport Convention. You mentioned the folky thing. We were very keen Fairport Convention fans at the time, those first 2 or 3 albums. Sandy Denny's voice, you know, is beautiful, I think. And I think this was quite influential on us, and you just wanted to try and do it. You see, people always assume that because you do all this sort of long, complicated stuff, that you don't like the short stuff. But of course you do. It's just the fact that someone else is doing that really well. So why bother to do it, almost, you know? You think, well, I mean, we're not going to write a song as good as I Want to Hold Your Hand, like I Want to Hold Your Hand. So, but we can do something like Supper's Ready, which no one else has ever done before. And, you know, that's much more fun for us, I think. We always tried to do the short stuff as well. And as I say, we got better over the years. But we had, you know, whether it was Harold the Barrel or I Know What I Like, whatever, these things are more concise. And we enjoyed doing that as well very much. So, you know, so we were trying to do... And we found an audience that we could take with us. And the interesting thing about longer songs is that they do work so well live. If you go to see groups who've got a succession of hits to play, and somehow it's very difficult to build up a real show. Yeah, audience love it. They hear, oh, another hit, that's great and everything. But, you know, when we played live, the songs that have really stood out have been, obviously, mentioned in The Cage and Afterglow, which tends to go together a lot. And then, obviously, later on, things like Domino and Home by the Sea, which are probably the classic songs from the later periods. Well, neither of those were singles or even any attempt at being a single, and yet they worked so well live. You could do things with them. You had a chance to build an atmosphere, worked very well visually, obviously, and just were very exciting. You could really build to a climax with both those songs. And you could intersperse them with the shorter stuff, the hits, the Invisible Touches, thrown all away and everything. And you could get quite a good show. And I think the Genesis live show benefited from having the two elements, but there was the long songs that were the key.
So the influence of folk music, I mean, Fairport Convention clearly were, you know, brilliant of their type at that time. How was this a challenge? I mean, how could you kind of listen to that stuff and say, okay, well, we are as a kind of folk music, but we're going somewhere else with it? I
don't think it was never that conscious, really. I mean, Mike and Ant, the original guitarist, obviously, you know, they listened to that, and the combination of guitars, you know, and you listen to a song like Fotheringay, you know, it just was incredibly appealing. So this idea of 2 guitarists playing and not playing the same thing, so you've got this interweaving parts and harmonic things going on that you didn't really know about. And the thing about Fairport Convention is they introduced a kind of pop element into it, and that's what made it so appealing. It wasn't wasn't sandals and beer and beards, you know. It was something else about it. I mean, I think the group, perhaps particularly after the later generations of the group, changed into more of a folk act than it was in those early 2 or 3 albums, you know. So they were, you know, I don't want to overstress their influence. They were one of many influences, you know, and we loved the sort of, let's say, the Family with that sort of shrieking voice and drums and stuff, you know. And I liked very much the sort of the rather pretentiously titled "In Hell 'Twas in I think, which was on Procol Harum's album, because it was a sort of longer piece that involved lots of little sections Back in the days when Matthew Fisher was still with them, and you got these little things going on which were really, really good, I think. So all these things were sort of like suggesting a way of doing it that hadn't really been done before, but none of them had really gone full whack. And we thought, well, we can go further than this. And one, and the idea of making much longer pieces, and we did this with Stagnation on Trespass, and then Musical Box more successfully, I think, on Nursery Crime, where you didn't repeat. You took an idea, you started off, you went somewhere else, and you tell a little story with the music. Over 10, 12 minutes, you could do that. Supper's Ready, it's 26 minutes. With very little repetition, maybe the odd little reprise in there, but mainly telling stories. So you hadn't have to go to the verse, chorus, middle, late, verse, chorus, which is what so many songs were. And you could try and do more things, use more chords, more rhythms, have a bit of fun. And some people liked that.
Where did the telling little stories come from? Was that from Peter, or was that all of you saying, well, that's the kind of thing?
Well, no, I think in the early days we were just probably too self-conscious to express sort of real thoughts and emotions. So stories are a way of getting around that. So we all wrote stories, to be honest, and that's how we did it to begin with. And, there was rich sources to be mined, like the Greek myths were a good source, and just, books, anything.
Nursery rhymes?
Yeah, well, the nursery rhymes, just whatever took your fancy. Science fiction books. It wasn't later on that suddenly, we started perhaps writing in slightly more things embedded more in reality. I suppose. And, even then we did it in a sort of quirky kind of way. A very good lyric, I think, of Pete's early days was Get 'Em Out by Friday, which has kind of got a fantasy element to it, but is quite rooted in the sort of real world as well. So you did it, and we just slowly evolved, I suppose. And then when, by the end, you get less self-conscious and you can actually express more real emotions. Still probably telling stories, actually. I've never really been one to express my actual sort of what's going on in my life in songs. It'd just be too boring. So kind of you take a real situation and then, you take it into a different direction and produce a result. So that's sort of, another fun to do. But in the early days, it was very much the stories were something to sort of, we found comfortable to hide behind in a way.
The combination of people that started out, you mentioned Ant just now. So just describe, if you can, how you all got together at school and what those initial groupings were.
Well, Peter and I, we came to the same house and the same school at the same time, and we were friends throughout the time there. We became particularly close friends, I think, in the last year or two we were there. Music being the thing that really sort of got us together, and we started writing songs together a bit. I used to play music. Pete, he was a pianist as well, so he would kind of we'd both battle for the piano, but I couldn't sing, so better if I played the piano and he sang. So we did a lot of stuff, and then Ant Phillips, who was in the same house as us, was friendly with Mike, who I didn't really know at school at all, and they wanted to make a tape. They'd done a little bit of work beforehand, but they wanted to make a tape, and Ant asked me if I wanted to play, organ on it or something, and I said, okay, great. I said, but why doesn't Pete come along as well, and we can do our song at the same time? And which is what we did, really. Originally, I think Ant was intended to sing his own songs, but he sang one song on that first tape, and I think we all suggested maybe that should wait for Pete to come. I said, Pete's got he's got a great voice, just let's let him do it, So the rest of that tape was Pete singing. And that's what had got us going, really. We were lucky with, Jonathan King, who was, went to the same school. He was, and used to love coming back as an old boy and sort of swanning around, so we thrust the tape on him, at least a friend of ours thrust the tape on him. And he liked some of what he heard, I think. I think he particularly liked Pete's voice. And sort of that gave us the chance we needed to go further.
You initially tried to make a hit single, essentially.
Well, it's kind of what you thought you wanted to do. We're only 16 or 17, you must understand that. And we'd written a few songs that we hoped would be hits, and obviously nothing had been hit. And then we, when Jonathan King, he was interested in us, we did quite a few tapes with him. He was sort of slowly losing interest, I think. And in order to retain his interest, Peter and I very definitely sat down and said, right, he likes the Bee Gees. We'll write a pastiche Bee Gees song pretty much, but write a good song as well. So we came up with this song, The Silent Sun. And King loved it. And he produced a single. And it could have been a hit. I think that could have been a hit, but it wasn't. In many ways, it's probably a great thing that it wasn't, because it gave us a chance to develop. And I think if we otherwise, we would have done more and more sort of poppy things or tried them. So we did 2 or 3 songs like that with King, and none of them, were any kind of success. And we then decided we really wanted to try and do something different, and he wasn't the man for that. Very much a pop, great pop ear, but not anything else. And we wanted to do something more ambitious, and in the end, that proved he was fine about that, really. I think he just we did it, and I think he cared that much because he didn't think it would go anywhere. And that's when we started working, really playing together. But we never really played together, being very much Pete and I playing together, and Mike and Anton, all of us playing together, rehearsing, with the possibility of playing live, which was more the dream of Ant and Mike than Peter and I. Peter and I were really not sure we wanted to do this.
You had this period in Christmas Cottage.
Well, that was later, actually.
That was later, sorry.
Prior to that, we were going around people's houses and just trying things out, with the idea that probably Peter and I thought we probably wouldn't stay around, but Mike and I wanted to do it, and we'd do it for a bit and see what happened. But of course, by the end of that period, we kind of were starting to really enjoy it. And, we used to, both of us, kind of say, oh, I don't think I can do this, and say the other saying, yeah, you must do it. And we all kind of did it. And then we thought we'd give it a year, see what happens. I was supposed to be, I was at university at this point, I'd been there for a year. And we thought we'd give it a year. And I took a year off from university to do it. And the idea being that we'd sort of see where it went. And by the end of this year, really, we got nowhere. But I knew that I really wanted to give this a go. I just felt, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. What are you going to do? If I don't do it, I'm going to really regret this. I was also, as Mike says in his book, I think I was probably worried that if they'd make it without me, what's worse than that? So I kind of, I wanted to do it. And I just loved music. It was a dream to be able to do it. So I stuck around. Unfortunately, we all stuck around, and we had 2 of them. That next year, we definitely made progress as a group, as a live group, with Anthony and everything. And it looked like we just, maybe we're just about to sort of get somewhere. And then, of course, Ant left, and that meant we were back to square one. It was, I really didn't think we'd survive. And I didn't think Mike would want to continue for a start, because he was so close to Ant. But we talked about it and decided we'd carry on. And at the same time, felt we had to obviously replace the drummer, a guy called John Mayhew, was a nice chap, but not a great drummer. And we felt we had to, therefore, if we're going to carry on, let's try and get the group good from right the way through, get a proper drummer, and find a replacement for Ant, which proved quite difficult.
You kind of get to the end of the first period, and then you recruit Phil and Steve Hackett shortly after that as well. We'd like to talk about both of them, just what they brought, and did things change as a group as a result?
Well, yes, obviously when Phil came initially, we were all a bit stiff, Pete has a great idea of rhythm, but doesn't have a great sense of rhythm. You know what I mean? He's very good at sort of understanding how it all works, but he can't really do it himself. Mike and I are probably a little bit less, certainly in those days, a bit less good at that anyhow, So, with someone who just made so much difference suddenly. It was so easy to play with Phil, and you didn't have to tell him what to do or anything. He would come up with his own things. Could be funny, but we sort of kind of very much in our own world. And he was sort of someone from outside who could make us all laugh and everything. And we did that first bit, which is a 4-piece, which was quite tough, I have to say. But it taught me an awful lot, because I tried to play as many of Ant's parts as I could. I had an electric piano going through a fuzz box, and I did a lot of the guitar parts through that, which obviously didn't sound that great, but it worked okay for some things. And so the idea of playing the organ part and trying to work out what was important, what I could leave out of the organ part, and play that part as well. And obviously Mike had to adapt a bit more as well, just sort of try and fill in some of those gaps. And it was quite a frustrating time, and it was quite difficult. the writing sessions, and you know, I was very bullshit in those days anyhow. But after, you know, as I said, the 4-piece was an interesting period, and then we got we kept auditioning for guitarists, but Mike, you know, was probably not the man to do it because he was looking for a place for France, so it ended up being more other people. We tried this guy Mick Barnard, who had been suggested to us by someone who was, you know, imaginative guitarist and was good, but just wasn't really quite there. We felt just didn't have quite a strong enough personality to be part of the group. So, you know, Peter and I, we responded to this ad in Melody Maker of a guy saying he was, you know, looking to do something slightly different. Went to see, and that was Steve, and we thought, you know, some of what he did would fit really well within what we did. So it was, you know, he was a great addition for us, I think. He had a slightly more of the classical edge to him, you know, which he introduced into Genesis slightly. And what we found was very much with Steve and I that we used to do a lot of stuff together in harmony, unison, or just playing off each other with lead lines. And, you know, this would work. I mean, something like, you know, you got a piece like Musical Box, for example, where we'd alternate a bit. He'd do the one solo and I'd do another solo, and that would work quite well. And then you get these moments like, let's say, Los Endos, where we played very much in harmony all the way through. We sort of wrote these parts. We did a lot of that on The Lamb and stuff as well. And it just used to work really well. I think we both like to think about it. We didn't really do sort of improvised solos. We tended to write instrumentals. And obviously you get there by improvising, don't get me wrong, but you sort of, when you actually go on stage, you've got a written part. And if you're playing in harmony with each other and the chords are changing quite a lot, you can't really improvise doing that. So it produced some really good moments. I think, I mean, in, you know, Los Endos being one of the best examples of, I think, where we sort of duetted very well, I thought. And, you know, it also meant Mike was able to become, I mean, he always was a rhythm guitarist, and he's a really good rhythm guitarist. I think that's his sort of, people underestimate the power of a rhythm guitar, you know. You talk about guitarists, you tend to think of sort of, you know, whether it's Hendrix or Clapton or Jeff Beck or whatever, all great musicians. But what a rhythm guitarist can do is something completely different, I think, you know, and you get some people like, I mean, all the riffs and everything you hear on pieces, but he was just really good at setting up a kind of mood. And he didn't want to be a lead guitarist, really, at that stage, Mike, at all. So he could lay down a basis, either on using bass or using guitar, which you know, Steve or I could do stuff on top of, if you like. And that was really good. And I think, you know, as I said, because Steve wasn't really so interested in the rhythm side of it, it gave Mike a real chance to explore that, and, you know, could really develop as a rhythm player.
Was there an easy settling into this new kind of band, new relationship?
Well, I think we had seniors and juniors, definitely, really. You know, I mean, they'd be the first to mention, I think both Phil and Steve were not kind of, you know, the opinions of Mike, Peter and I carried more weight, if you like, and we got our sort of ideas through more often. Certainly as writers. Phil at that point really didn't do much writing, so it didn't worry him too much. It worried Steve more, I think, because he had more writing ideas, but some of the stuff we really didn't felt. The rest of it didn't really want to do, didn't fit with that, what we did. We tried to pick the areas that we liked a lot, and he did come up with some great stuff, you know. You know, particularly with Can You Do It in the Coastliners in the early days, and then things like Blood on the Rooftops later on. You know, some wonderful moments we could use and make really good use of, I think, but there were other things we weren't quite so into, which, you know, he liked. So, you know, that must have been a bit frustrating for him, I think. And I think it was only after... I mean, Steve was sort of starting to become a kind of senior, if you like, by the time he left. And then he left. It surprised me he left at a strange moment, I think. In terms of as a player and a sort of arranger, Phil was kind of pretty much got in there fairly fast, I think, but not as a writer until, you know, 1980 or after Face Value, when he started to get his confidence as a writer going a bit more. So, yeah, I mean, so that's... I think they contributed less as writers and much more as players. They made us sound like a professional group, which we didn't really sound like in the early days.
In a sense, it was kind of the first time you'd got full-blown professionals in with you. Thinking of, like, Phil had done this sort of working on other people's albums. He's sort of slogged around.
He hadn't done so much at the time, I suppose. And to be honest, John Mayhew had come out of a group called Steamhammer, who had been sort of done the circuit a bit. So he'd been around a little bit. So he was brought in as a professional. But, Phil was a very adaptable player. And I think as most drummers are, they sort of can do more than one thing. I mean, if they're really good drummers like that. So he was able to, any frustrations he felt with having to play with us, if you like, he could take out by playing with other people, particularly in the more jazz rock area, which he loved, So, it's sort of, I can't remember what I was going to say now.
Okay.
So I'm stopping.
Let's
Good jib if you want.
Let's move on from that. Musical box on Nursery Crime, right? It's now when we see it on the old tapes played live. There's Peter in full theatrical performance there with all the different stages of it and so on. It's fantastic. But clearly, at that point when you were writing it, you didn't envisage it that way at all. It wasn't that you wrote it in order for it to be a theatrical performance. No,
it wasn't at all. I mean, it was a piece of music we'd had around for a bit actually, which Mike, the start of it, a thing that Mike and Ant had been working on, and we used it as an instrumental bit in some music for a potential BBC programme that never got shown. And it also was a nice bit. We wanted to make more of it, so we used two of the bits in that as the basis for it and wrote a melodic line on top of it. And then, it sort of started to want to go other places, and we tried other things, and all these sort of things happened, I suppose. And, the idea of having done Stagnation, which had been sort of like gone through various different moods, we wanted to do something along those lines, but perhaps with a bit more sort of meat to it. It was not a very conscious thing. We just, at that stage, we were quite happy for songs to go on for a long time. We liked that, so we did. And, went through two or three quite contrasts again between the quiet bit and the loud bit and everything. And then this very serene ending, which was kind of a bit of a fluke, really. Mike just started playing these two chords on the guitar like that, ding, ding, and I started playing these chords on top of it, which sort of was like as a fugue thing, really. And it just sounded, it was very triumphant, sort of had a sort of uplifting, glorious quality about it. And again, like I said before with Supper's Ready, I originally saw it as an instrumental piece, totally instrumental. Of course, then Pete starts, I've got a story, I've got a storyteller, I've got to start singing. So he starts singing on top of what I've written. I think, you're ruining it, But then you sort of start to think, well, actually, this is sounding really good, And after all, I'm only playing a chord sequence. And it became that sort of last bit there. You stand there with your fixed expression, that sort of whole bit, I think, became, the real high point, I think, from that album. And, sends shivers down your spine when you hear it. And the way it sort of just builds and builds and builds to this sort of kind of pseudo-classical ending, if you like, which was fun to do. So it's kind of where it starts and where it ends, I suppose. It's the real key of that song. Some of the middle stuff, it could have been different, but the beginning and the end are crucial.
Do you think it's a whole other experience seeing the theatrical side when Peter's in full costume?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, the story was always there, and he just was acting out the story. And I think where he came on in the red dress from the album cover, it's actually his wife Jill's dress. In fact, he came on with the fox's head on, and it was just playing the thing. Oh God, what's going on here? And as we said before, this also got us on the front page of Melody Maker, so we thought, well, this is okay. Anyhow, after that, having done that, he decided, once he got into the idea of doing this sort of thing, the idea obviously of actually playing the role of the person in the song, who's a sort of obviously a young child who gets prematurely old, and so he comes on as this in this old man's mask, which is actually really spooky, and it really worked very well. That just simple lighting, audience not expecting it the first time. He comes out as an old man, and saying, "Who's this guy?" And sings this bit, and I think it's very moving, and so it just enhances what the song already has. We've always tried to do that with visuals right through to the present day. You not to slap something on, not just use lasers because you've got them or whatever, you try and make it part of the song. So you try and get the builds and sometimes the sort of lyrical content to be illustrated by what you're doing. And I think Musical Box was sort of the first time we really did that successfully, and it was very simple. And that came obviously from Peter and was very effective.
And by the time it came to Foxtrot, you obviously had picked up a following. I mean, slogging around the country in the baker's van. You kind of moved on a bit, and you got a manager.
We've got a transit van now.
Yeah, and you got Tony Stratton-Smith involved as well. Would you like to talk a little bit about that period and about him?
Well, yes, I think what you're looking for in those early days, you must understand, not selling any records, you're not really selling many concert tickets, and you're not really making any money, but you are sort of keeping afloat, I suppose. You're looking for people to have some enthusiasm in you, somebody who likes you, And the thing with Tony Stratton-Smith, we were played with this group, 1hr Bird, who we actually were big fans of anyhow. And he said that their manager, Tony Stratton-Smith, was starting up this label, Charisma, and maybe he'd be interested for the label. And so we thought, well, okay, that sounds interesting. So he came along. First of all, 1hr Bird's producer, John Edginton, came along, and then later on, Tony Stratton-Smith came along with him, and he really liked it, or at least he really saw potential for it on his label. Only were 4 acts on the label. Well, 3 at that point, I think. It was Van der Graaf Generator, Lindisfarne, 1hr Bird, and us. And then he added Audience and 1 or 2 other groups later on, So it was, they took a personal interest in it, if you like. I don't think the rest of the company were quite so sure. There was a guy there called Fred Munt who had no idea what we were about. He would, like a lot of people actually, who really don't like the band. If you don't like the band, you really don't like it. It's that kind of band, and he didn't. But he did the job, and he was a friendly sort of chap, quite funny. So he did the job. So he was acted as kind of various sort of tour manager and various sort of things for us in those early days. But Strat believed in us, and particularly, I think he really liked Foxtrot. Nursery Crime we did for him first of all, and then Foxtrot was very much. Obviously, Trespass was also done, but Trespass was a little bit different. I think he got into all that, and was always behind us really, and just that enthusiasm. Someone who really liked what you did. The business was full of enthusiasts in those days. So he was not a professional in a sense. He wasn't a record company man at all. He was someone who spent far too much money on all the wrong things. He supported groups that, I don't know. I mean, Lindisfarne made him money. It was luck, I think. I don't think Van der Graaf or us ever did much for him really. Most of the time we were with him. So he was very important to us, and we liked to be told. If you were feeling down and you had a Duff concert and things like that, he'd come out and say, "You're wonderful, I love you," and so you make you feel fantastic. You need guys like that. Very important, man.
To what extent did you, feel that you were being steered? I don't know. Someone like Fred Munt, I was interested in, because presumably, if he's a tour guy, he's putting you in all kinds of venues.
No, he was only that. He wasn't the guy putting us in venues. Right. He was just the guy who was. Right. There. I mean, when we did a tour with Lindisfarne and Van der Graaf, he was the guy who got us in the coach and that sort of stuff. And, he also worked in the office, and he had no influence on what we did. To be honest, nobody did, which is one of the extraordinary things which I think a lot of contemporary groups might find kind of difficult to believe. We had no record company interference at all. We gave them the result every time. That's all they got. Later years, we even told them what the single was. We didn't play them the rest of the album. I mean, we were able to do that. Incredibly lucky, I think. Because I don't think people, the idea of 26-minute songs and everything would have not appealed to most. I mean, that particular record company did want it, of course, so it was fine, but it wouldn't appeal too much to kind of your modern record company. And, they just let us get on with it, really. They backed us, they gave us the money to do what we wanted. We didn't really realise it was all against future earnings, so we didn't pay it back for many years. But it was, at least they were there, and if we'd had split up at that moment, we wouldn't have owed a penny. So it was pretty good.
I want to ask this question, and I haven't had an answer on it yet from anyone. Is why selling England by the pound was actually a slogan of the Labour Party in '73, I think. It's kind of around the time of the potential. It was Ted Heath, and there was going to be a Labour Party election. Yeah, and why was that used as the title?
It was Peter's idea. It came in the song, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, as a phrase in there, and we just thought it's a fantastic phrase, and we should use it as the title, It wasn't particularly supposed to be, it's a bit like just a phrase you hear and you use it. It's like Pete used Games Without Frontiers as a title as one of his songs, but it was nothing to do with It's a Knockout you saw on TV, or even the charity group, It was just a good phrase that he felt kind of could work. And I think that's how it was with with that, really. It just sounded good, and I think it represented so much. It was so good as to what we were trying to do. You know, we were a very English group trying to make it in the world, if you like, and so we're sort of selling ourselves, really. So that's, and Peter might have more profound things to say on it than that, but that's my memory of it. And, you know, it's still one of the best titles we've had. I mean, I know it came from somewhere else, but still a great title.
No, I think it's a fantastic title. And the idea of the very English group sort of links back to something I was trying to get at, but maybe we'll have another dig at this, is, you know, songs like The Musical Box, where you've got a kind of mixture of the English nursery rhyme and the kind of the English tradition in there. And there's a sort of pastoral thing running through as well. All that comes in. Is that because it reflects you guys and where you came from, and you know your sense of, I mean, you like to live in the country, or is it just something that's coming from you very directly, I'm wondering?
Well, I'm not one to answer that. I'm presumably, yes. I have no idea. It's not something ever a conscious thing. It's just what appealed to us and what we did. It just seemed to come out in this sort of English kind of way. I said to him, our influences, you know, with the sort of folky influences and other things, we're probably more... We like to take influences from elsewhere as well. I mean, we've mentioned some of the American acts that we liked. I mean, Peter and I particularly were very keen on American soul music, you know, I mean, Otis Redding. You know, I just love the way that... I love the soulful voice on kind of quite a lush backing. You know, you think, so I Put a Spell on You by Nina Simone is just archetypal of that. You've got this, you know, very almost classical sort of string sound in the background with this very sort of, you know, soulful, moving voice on top of it. And I love that combination. And Peter obviously had that kind of voice, so really liked that kind of thing when we could use it, and we did it a lot. I mean, from Looking for Someone onwards, really, we were doing that.
That's the first song on Trespass.
Trespass.
Yeah, that comes out very strongly. It's like such a clear, soulful voice. It's quite startling. When you
well, I think that's, you know, that's why we wanted to start the album with. I mean, Pete never sang, you know, on that. It was far and away the best singing on that album. It just sounded great. And the version we used was actually the thing he did on the rough mix. His version, his singing, pretty much used that because it just sounded so good. You know, the song, and it sort of set a certain area of where we wanted to kind of be, I suppose. And the Englishness, I think, came perhaps more from the guitar-y things in a way initially. Things like White Mountain and Dusk, they sort of feel very English, I think. The other thing we tended to do a little bit, I suppose, was, it's a curious thing, but some of the early Genesis music was very definitely intended not to swing. That's a kind of strange thing, that. But I was talking to some guys later on, some American guys, one of these jazz rock groups, something. They want to know how you did that, because they'd all been taught up. Everything had to swing. It was the thing. So everything's got that little bit of something about it. If you want a thing to be totally square, sometimes that really works well. And you do a song like, well, Squonk, obviously, we're trying very hard to do that. But even if you go back to things like Firth the Fifth, it's very straight. There's no kind of hint at sort of... And that's quite English as well. Because the American stuff that we loved, you know, whether you're talking about sort of Tamla or whatever, that's all got that swing to it, you know. So whereas the English groups were happier to perhaps be a bit squarer. You know, Beatles often were quite square, I think, and the Kinks and all that sort of stuff. And they were sort of big influences on us. It's difficult to know, you know, why. I can hear it that we sound English, but I don't quite know. There was no conscious attempt to do that. That's just how it was.
Interesting you mentioned Firth the Fifth. Darryl talked to us about the kind of having to relearn, in a way, a particular style of guitar playing, and I imagine it ties in with what you're saying, that there isn't swing in that, and he's an American musician who's...
Well, it's partly that. Originally, I'd written this piece just for flute and piano, as is how you hear it earlier on in the song. And it was Steve's idea. He said, "Look, let's just try it a bit bigger. You know, let's go for it. You know, I'll play guitar and play the mellotron." And so I did this, and just suddenly it was, you know, took it into sort of like King Crimson's zone a bit, I suppose. But you know, I think it became something else because the guitar was so strong, such a classical. You know, the little rundown is so classical, and and became sort of one of the high points on that album, Selling England.
And it's something you played live?
Well, we played that bit of it. Normally the two instrumental bits, which were probably the two strongest bits of it, the keyboard solo, which gave me a bit of a party piece, I suppose. I know a lot of pianists who use it as their party piece. And if you go onto YouTube, you'll find hundreds of people playing it. It's just one of those things, I don't know. They can all play it better than me, I'm sure, because when I stopped playing it live, we were playing in Drury Lane. We had a residency there for about 4 or 5 days. And on, I think it was the second or the third day, I used to start further fifth with the piano part. But I had to play it on an electric piano. In those days, electric pianos were pretty basic things. This RMI piano, which had no touch sensitivity and didn't have full keyboard. So I used to play it, and it didn't sound that great, but it was, people wanted to hear it, so I did it. And one time I was playing it, and I was quite enjoying myself, and I went up and I started playing it. And I started playing it like I played on the album. Went up, no keys. So it's that moment you think. So I just threw my hands up in the air like that, and the rest of the band look at me like this, and Phil goes, 3, 4, and they go into the song. And so, I mean, after that, I also, because I felt it was kind of like after we'd done for the next tour, we didn't do it obviously on the Lamb tour, because we didn't do any of those songs. When it came to Trick of the Tail, we wanted to do the song, but we did it without the introduction. It just sort of seemed a little bit self-indulgent. But it was, but anyhow, the keyboard, the version with the synthesizer and drums and everything, which was always quite exciting. A certain element of the audience loved that kind of stuff, where everything, it's like real band play, orchestra stuff. The drums, everybody's doing their own thing. It's very important. Every beat has to be hit, and it's quite complicated, and it excites some people. That's where they're going to have a pee, but other people, that's them, the high point. So that, combined with the very serene and much more straightforward guitar solo afterwards, used to be the two bits of that song that survived right through to the end.
Maybe it's a point to talk about you and Mike, and kind of the generation, the generating of this kind of what I call the engine of Genesis, which is there in the early stages, but then it's there in your final record. You can that sort of sound that is.
Well, on Calling All Stations, there was no one else, so it had to be just us, didn't it?
Right.
Really?
Prior to Calling All Stations,
Yeah, I think we sort of used to have this way of working, particularly building up a sound, which, I mean, obviously we mentioned the Apocalypse of 9/8, and obviously Cinema Show would be another one, the last second half of Cinema Show. I mean, a lot of this involved Phil anyhow, who's very much there, but the kind of way you sort of... Mike's very good, as with guitar, it's very good setting up kind of rhythms and things on the things, and I would play chords on top of it, try and do as much as I could with whatever he'd set up. If he was on one chord, something, then there's so much I could do, and I'd push it somewhere else, try to, and then after a bit he'd come along and join me on that new note, and you'd sort of get an effect, really. It was a fun way of doing it. It's great to have people, not everyone want to play lead all the time, you see. I think if you've got some guitarists, once, by the time we were down to a 3-piece, we just want to play lead all the time, and he always wanted to play rhythm or bass, really, and the lead would come later. I mean, a couple of times the lead line was important, and so you ended up with this kind of combination of the two of us being very crucial, I think, to the things, particularly in later Genesis, I suppose. So sometimes, I think, sometimes things you didn't let them become what they were obviously going to become. I mean, take a song like Dodo, where there's a really great guitar riff in that, which could have been a disco hit, really, which is the verse, but kind of being how I am and not really being so much into that kind of music, kind of did something with it that changed it a little bit and made it part of this sort of rather cumbersome sort of big song, Dodo-like sort of song, which I think was quite interesting and worked quite well, but it was different from what it could have been. You could have had a hit out in the middle of the verse of that, I think, but we didn't go that route. So we act as sort of helpers and spoilers for each other's bits sometimes, which is good. I think that's sometimes you take things where you don't think they're going to go, and that can be quite exciting. And when we started writing Trick of the Tail, and Steve wasn't there because he was still doing his solo album, that sort of first moment when we started doing that opening of Dance on a Volcano, it just was such a key moment, that really. Mike was playing guitar, I started playing these chords, and I didn't play slightly less obvious chords than the ones that were suggested by the riff, you know. And it just, suddenly, that was Genesis. It was a whole thing, you know, it became something. And we knew we were on a way. You know, you just sort of, the key moment to give you the confidence that you could do this. It wasn't going to just be a combination of solo songs, although they were very important on that album. It was going to be group stuff that would be able to, you know, be something very different. And I think Volcano particularly, and then later Los Endos, which came, were the two sort of key tracks from that point of view.
This is a weird connection, because I should go on to talk about Peter, but I'll just go with Steve at the moment. The loss of Steve after Wind and Wuthering, right? Did that seem, I mean, you said that was pretty strange and that he was just beginning to kind of settle.
I was surprised he left at that point. I wasn't surprised that he left. I never thought he'd be there forever, because I felt he was slightly outside it, you know. But I was surprised at the moment he left, because, you know, we'd done this, particularly the song Blood on the Rooftops, and parts of 11th Hour Lamar particularly, had sort of been things which he'd been quite involved with. And I just thought maybe he finally sort of feels he's getting enough out, you know. But he'd done the solo album, and I think he'd really got sort of a taste for it a bit. And I think he just perhaps got fed up with me. People do. And not just me, but all of us to some extent. We were did tend to kind of dominate a little bit. You know, he was always probably felt that he never was quite an equal member. And he wanted to be, and so he moved on. I mean, from the point of view of the band, it was the least traumatic. Not because I missed Steve in many ways, because especially as a guitarist, but also he perhaps was slightly more in my corner in terms of, you know, being a bit weird at times, and I like to do things slightly more off the wall, and he liked that too. Whereas Mike and Phil a bit more straightforward, you know. So it kind of, I missed him from that point of view, but it didn't really miss, you know, I felt we could easily cope with it. We could cope with Pete leaving, which was obviously a massive thing. And I felt Steve leaving was not going to be such a big moment. Apparently, in England, the music scene had changed very much. We were fairly unaware of this and came out with Follow You, Follow Me, which was a big hit, which we were very lucky with, I think. You know, sort of Yes weren't there anymore, and ELP and all these people sort of suddenly weren't there anymore, and we were the only people left doing what you might call, you know, well, I hate the word prog. It used to be called underground, but that was perhaps when it was still underground, and it wasn't at that point. But anyhow, it kind of just trying to do things a little bit different.
Do you think that it was an inevitable kind of progression that you would either die, like Yes and the LP and or change? I mean, was that inevitable?
Well, looking back on it, I suppose it was, but we were happy to do that. We weren't particularly in touch with what was going on at all. I mean, I can hear whole Top of the Pops shows on, you know, see them, not know any song on them, never heard them. Many bands I've never heard. I mean, even now I can't name anybody really. I mean, people, you know. I don't think I could name you a single Beyoncé song, for example. I mean, I've never had since 1967, I haven't really listened very much to music. I obviously hear stuff without really knowing who it is. Pick up a few favourites along the way, always, you know. So, what was I going to say? What were we talking about before I diverted there?
Was it inevitable that you either changed or died?
I think it was sort of, I think if we hadn't, we would have struggled. I think we felt we were repeating ourselves a little bit on Duke with the reprises, which I said before, and I think he was conscious of that ourselves and just sort of thought, well, you know, there are other ways of doing this, you know. Let's just carry on, just try some other things a little bit. And I think with Abacab in particular, there's a few things we tried, really streamlining some things, you know, keeping Abacab, the song itself, you know, just not filling it all up with the keyboard and just doing little answering phrases and stuff, you know, rather than doing all the way through. And then little ideas like Keep It Dark, trying to keep a sort of incredibly simple rhythmic idea going through and a repeated riff and seeing what you can do with it. You know, so all these things led us a certain direction. And, you know, during this time, obviously, you know, we probably all got better at, a bit more confident, I think, in being able to keep things slightly sort of smaller. And also because we had our own studio by this time, we were able to put things down much earlier. We didn't have the same feeling, we went in a rehearsal room, playing the same song for 3 months, by which time, it was unrecognisable from what we first played because we just kept embellishing it and adding little bits. So we were able to keep it fairly concise. And but some things ended up much more concise than I thought they were going to be. The song that really took me by surprise in many ways was Land of Confusion. We'd written this, and it probably had a couple more other bits in it, but it seemed to be quite a big thing. I thought it was going to be a big song, And then we finally did it. It was this small song. I think one of our best singles, as it happens. But it kind of turned out a bit different. I think I never really thought it was going to be at the beginning. But, that's the way it works, really. It's very difficult to plan. We've never really been ones for trying to sort of do this or do that. We just do what occurs to us with the people that are there. And I think the natural slight simplification of the music, with Peter leaving and Steve leaving, it left I was the main standard bearer for the kind of, and Mike and Phil, as I said, a bit more concise. So we had a bit more concise stuff there. I mean, I like concise music, so, I was quite happy to write that and be involved in the writing of that. So and it felt quite fresh too, I sort of somehow just doing it, another intense thing at that point in time, particularly in the mid-80s, I don't know, didn't feel right. A 26-minute epic wouldn't have felt right in 1986, simple as that.
I think Mike said in his book, and it's probably riled you.
It was all lies.
Was that you that you yourself could never write a hit because your use of language was too kind of esoterical.
Well, let's put it this way: a lyric of mine has never been on a big Genesis hit single, but then often ended up being the second singles, like Duchess or Many Too Many or Keep It Dark, by which time everyone got the record, so no one's going to buy the single, are they? He may be right. I don't know. I think I've written some lyrics that could have been hit. I don't think that's really the one way or the other. We tended to, when it came to the later albums, tended to be, I tended to go do the long songs because I liked doing them. And I liked getting my teeth into something like Domino, where I could really explore ideas and go further. And Home by the Sea, where I could sort of take a sort of, kind of fantasy idea and make more of it, if you like. That appealed to me more perhaps than writing, short things. But I used to enjoy doing that. And I said, Duchess, which I like the lyric. Of my lyrics, it's my favourite of my lyrics, I suppose, in a way, where just a simple idea of the rise and fall of a female rock star, seemed to just work very well with the music. If you can, it's that marriage of the two that works well. But in terms of the music, obviously, I've been involved in writing quite a few hits.
Yeah, I guess he was talking about the lyrics.
It's true.
But we can disagree with him, obviously.
No, I don't necessarily disagree with him, really. I mean, I can't. The facts would say, but he's probably right. I don't know. Mike's a funny one because he's written lots of really good lyrics with like on Follow You Follow Me and Land of Confusion, for example. But then when he does his solo stuff, he often doesn't seem to write the lyrics. He gets other guys to do it. I think it's a strange thing, but there you go. You can ask him about that. I
mean, the sound of Tony Banks is certainly in Genesis is inevitably linked to the fantastic keyboard sounds that you produce, and I know you play lots of other instruments, but that's not your kind of main sound. Did you listen to the organ at school? Did you play the organ at school? Did you love hymns? Did you go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we all, Peter and I particularly, we really loved hymns, and also at the end of school chapel was not a favourite thing for us, but the end of the Sunday thing, often a guy would stay there and would play something, and you could stay and listen. And you'd hear sort of classic pieces of Carter and Fugue and things like this. And the sound was just fantastic. I used to love it, really. But it was, quite a different animal, I suppose. I only ever played piano when I was at school, and in the early Genesis thing, everything I wrote with Peter, we wrote piano. I played a little bit of organ on Genesis Revelation. We actually borrowed a guy's organ. Which was interesting, it was a semitone sharp. Never quite knew why that was. And I had this song called Fireside Song, which I remember the first time I played the organ on it, I came in on the chorus, we'd bring the organ on the chorus, dong. And it was a semitone above what we thought it was going to be. And we thought, actually, that sounds quite good. So we kept that. But it meant I had to remember all the time that everything had to be transposed in order to play on this bloody thing. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. So when we decided to go, the idea of playing live, playing professional, I knew that a piano, in those days, you couldn't play a piano live in any kind of real rock situation. So it was down to an organ. So we went out and bought a Hammond organ. And really, initially, I started trying to play piano on the organ. I had two ways of playing the organ, really. One was to play piano on it, and the other was just to hold down the chords. And so that sort of, you just kind of learnt, I suppose. I just learned how to cope with all this stuff. I mean, a lot of organ playing is that, anyhow, actually, to be honest. And particularly when you get to the stage of, with synthesizers and everything, holding down stuff is quite a lot of what you do. So I very much developed as a player, I think. I was confident on the piano in the early days, and then it got more, just as the instruments came available. I was lucky it was sort of growth in instruments. So the organ was there, and then the electric pianos, and the idea of putting them through fuzz boxes and stuff came out, and then the mellotron suddenly was available, produced a whole bank of new sounds, and then the synthesizer slowly started to come in. And so I was sort of there as it grew. I was able to kind of grow with it, really. I mean, the first synthesizers I couldn't cope with at all. I was not into this sort of wiring stuff, But then ARP brought out this little instrument called ARP Pro Soloist, which just had a lot of presets on it of very simple sounds. And it just sounded great, You could play it. It had a really fast-sprung keyboard, so you could play very fast on it, more easily. And, I used it obviously on, Cinema Show, I think was the first thing I kind of used it on. And it was just it was a sort of real opener for me.
Did you miss the once you got really into the electronic side? Did you really miss the Hammond? Well,
I think the way I used the Hammond, I could substitute, and I had ways of making pretty much an organ sound, like the full organ sound I used on things like 1st to 5th. I could pretty much get that out of the keyboards, particularly the Prophet 10, which sort of became a key instrument when I was using it in those days. So I didn't really miss it. I could still have the big block chords if I wanted them. And when we later on came into doing, even when I was doing on the reunion tour in 2007, whatever, I didn't have an organ, but I had instruments that could simulate the organ or give the same effect. So no, I didn't really miss that. I liked having the ability to do all these other things, though. You could. You could play drums. I mean, that was so. Sometimes you did that. It was quite fun to be able to do the different things on that. A lot of bass, obviously, and which meant the mic could play rhythm. And something like Land of Confusion, for example. The bass line is a keyboard on that. I mean, it's programmed, so I'm not really playing it in a sense, but it's sort of. So things kind of evolved over the years, and you'd use what tools were available.
One thing that that Phil was talking about was when he wrote The Last Spike. I think did he produce the lyric first, or did you?
No, he wrote the lyric afterwards.
Right.
It was unusual for him to. He just said he would like to try and write the lyric to the long song. I was pretty much ready to do it, as I normally did, but he kind of wanted to do it and said, well, "Okay, great, then why not?" So
you had the long song was there instrumentally, and he put the lyric on top of that. And for a start, it was quite an unusual thing for Phil to be writing the lyrics to a long song. But also, had you in combination worked in that way before?
Well, not with him writing the lyric to a long song, but he'd written lyrics to loads of the songs that we'd written together or whatever. I think it was, an interesting idea to do, really. I mean, I think, he had this idea. He'd always been the railways and how they sort of started and everything. So it was something he kind of wanted to do, and I think it produced a great lyric. I think it was good, I didn't really feel that strongly about it. Lyric writing has always been something that, I'm not in the business to write lyrics. I have written loads of lyrics. Some good, some bad, some very bad. But I quite enjoy doing it. Once I get into it and I can get past that first stage of the blank sheet of paper and what the hell am I going to write about, I quite enjoy it. And but I was very, very happy. Phil was, writing lots of good lyrics at that point. He'd become a very good lyric writer, I think. Great at just grasping a little phrase like invisible touch, like no son of mine, and using them within a song and just making something of them, I think. So I thought, I was very happy to do that, really. And, I don't think it's our greatest long song, I have to say, personally. It's sort of... But I think the lyric work has sort of wistfulness about it that works well. And it's, his contribution in that sense was very good.
So let's just go back to Phil becoming a songwriter or lyric writer. That point, that sort of pivotal point around Duke, and he plays you some of the songs he's written.
First time I ever heard that was when we were mixing, well, it must have been Duke, in Maison Rouge studio in London, and he just put it on, and it was just the drum box and the organ chords. That's the first time I ever heard it. Now, if he'd ever just played just that to me and said, "What do you think?" I'd have probably said, "Well, we've got to do something else." I think I'd have bound to want to say, "Well, you can't do that all the way through the song. You can't choose one chord sequence, bass note all the way through, And at that time, obviously, the drum wasn't there. It just kind of has an incredibly strong atmosphere all the way through it.
So when he played those to you, I mean, in a sense, this was still, the guys in Genesis listening to the music that one of you had written.
Yeah, but he'd been involved in, he'd obviously increasingly involved in writing bits and pieces here and there, and he'd written the lyrics to particularly some songs on Then There Were Three, like Little Nemo, and that one was called Ballad of Big, and things like that. I mean, the various bits and pieces, he certainly was getting, more used to it in a sense. And he'd always had a real penchant for sort of James Taylor and that kind of thing. And I think that's sort of where he started to write, People were kind of surprised in a way that his album wasn't all kind of jazz rock and all this stuff. That was very much one side of him. But his other side, he'd always loved this, particularly James Taylor, that sort of thing. And so that's when he started writing it on his own. That's sort of more where he went with these kind of personal ideas and actually expressing things he actually meant in his lyrics, which is a whole new thing for us, We'd never sort of thought about that, really. I mean, a little bit with Follow You, Follow Me and stuff, but not really, not in the sense of expressing your sort of, what you're actually thinking in a song. And so pretty much, I think, with Misunderstanding and Please Don't Ask, they were pretty much fairly complete at that point. And so he'd definitely grown as a lyric writer and in confidence. I still think he found it slightly more difficult when he was writing on a group song. He wasn't quite so confident, say, he wrote the lyrics to Behind the Lines, for example. And he had a first draft that, none of us were quite sure about. And he was immediately, "Oh, no, we won't do that, and went to do something else, And it wasn't really until, after he started an album or two later, I think, where he decided he had the confidence to do. See?
Let's keep going on Phil. You were saying that later, Phil writing all the lyrics, you weren't...
Well, he didn't, he didn't write, when he first became the singer of the band, he didn't write many lyrics. He wrote some, little bits and pieces here and there. It wasn't really until, obviously, the two songs on Duke we just talked about, and then, after that, I think he sort of, after Success at Face Value, he got a confidence with his own lyric writing, and he got quite into this idea of writing lyrics that, that's sort of more the sound of it almost in a way than what it meant a bit, with a song like Mama, for example, which is his lyric. It's a very strong kind of atmosphere to that, where you're not quite sure what it's all about. I mean, that whole song is all about atmosphere anyhow, really. But by the time it came to things like Invisible Touch, I mean, just little phrases like that would just sort of come on. This is such a great phrase, Invisible Touch, He really turned into a really good lyric writer, which, I think it's just years of singing and doing solo stuff and all the rest of it that taught him.
That whole period of around the mid-'80s, Invisible Touch period, where you're getting all these hits, suddenly. Was that just very exciting, or were you kind of slightly frustrated that they only think we do hits now, that these short things, when actually we do a whole load of other stuff?
With Follow You, Follow Me, it was the first time a lot of people were even aware of us. I had friends who didn't know, sort of, what's he doing? I don't really know, and then suddenly they heard us, hear us on the radio. So I loved all that, actually. And it probably had an effect on us for that reason. We all enjoyed it. Suddenly we were having hits. And I think once you'd had Follow You, Follow Me, it kind of opened the door. And with a song, less obvious hits like Turn It On Again and Mama, which are kind of neither of which are very totally straightforward pop songs, were able to be hits because we were accepted now. We'd be played on Radio 1, whereas in the old days we could only be played on sort of deepest, darkest sort of something. And it kind of, it was very exciting, really. I mean, we had a fantastic period. First of all as an underground group, and then as a kind of what you might call mainstream group, and fantastic to have experienced all that, really. But I think once it got to that period after 1992 or so, at least we had a couple of greatest hits sort of live albums there, which did pretty well. And that was sort of after that, it got kind of definitely felt it was more difficult. And obviously recording all stations, which something we tried, which perhaps, still some good stuff on that, I think, but, experiment that didn't work on record. I thought it worked really well live, actually, but, might have been worth going on with, but we didn't. And that's why it was very gratifying when we came back in 2007 to find we still had an audience, because we had really no idea, British press can be fairly cruel. I think it's all those people that used to work in the NME in the 70s, and now it's distributed amongst all the newspapers, and they all hated us then, and they still hate us now. Not so much it's just something about us they hate. I don't think it's actually the music, it's just us. I don't quite know why that is, but we're sort of friendly people, But that's sort of how it is a little bit, I think. And, whereas in places like, Germany and stuff, we still seem to be rated a bit.
Was it that they didn't like the Post-Gabriel period?
No, they didn't like the Gabriel period either. In fact, a lot of the guys hated the Gabriel period more than anything. Of course, now they look back and say, a golden period, but we used to get quite a lot of stick then. Obviously, we always had some fans, it did right the way through, I'd say that the only time we kind of were popular with the press was when Peter left. And Trick or Tell came out and actually got pretty much universally pretty good reviews. But that didn't last, because it was shortly after that, sort of the music scene changed very much in England, and we became part of the sort of, the dinosaur brigade that weren't supposed to be there. It was frustrating in a way, but I mean, I don't know, what's it matter really? I mean, it doesn't really matter what the critics think, it's more what the audience thinks, and seem to have managed to retain an audience. It'd be nice to have been liked as well. Peter seems to have managed to pick up pretty good reviews. I mean, he's sort of bridged the gap quite well. I think all the world music stuff and everything helped a lot. And, he's sort of... whereas poor old Phil at times has been very... received a lot of very unjust criticism, I think, and became the butt of a lot of jokes and stuff. But nevertheless, when people heard that advert was on TV and the drum riff played by the gorilla, everyone loved it, So in a sense, it's not something about the thing that people don't like rather than the actual music, I think.
And there's a kind of reassessment going on. I saw there was a piece in The Guardian about, was Phil Collins the sort of godfather of modern music or whatever?
Well, of course, this is as unreasonable as anything else, if you like. But there was these American guys who all did this tribute album of doing lots of Phil songs and things, because he was certain kind of music that he definitely was at the forefront of, I don't really understand why people do the things they do. Certain groups of people always get bad press. Coldplay always seem to get bad press, but they do great music. So I'm sure they don't care that much, Whereas other people who sort of get constant praise, whether it's sort of Lou Reed or whatever, I don't know why. I mean, it's a couple of good songs there, but is he really as good as that? So it's just the way it is. Some people, there's certain people seem to always get praise. Bowie always gets praise. Well, I think he's fantastic too, so I don't remind that. But other people I don't think are quite as good seem to get a lot of praise too. And you think, well, it seems a bit arbitrary, and I think it's a lot down to what you liked when you were 13 or 14, and a lot of how you see things as well. Sometimes people don't like the fact that we originally came from a public school and all that, but for God's sake, now most groups seem to. There's an incredible number of groups who do. So it really can't be thrown just against. And poor old Phil didn't anyhow. And did Steve. So.
And that kind of thing just does not wash in America at all.
Well, they don't care, you see. Yeah. And nowhere else apart from England does it matter. That's why it's been so different for us everywhere else, That's why it was always great fun for us touring in America. It was just the music, you know, and we used to have a fantastic time over there. You know, throughout the 80s and the early 90s, so we were just, you know, fantastic crowds, great reception. And generally it was a lot of fun. No, very, obviously you had people. Also, I think the thing about when you're travelling like that is you don't get a chance to read the reviews, which is quite a good thing, really, because, you know, you're on to the next town, so you never read the review that says, oh, they were a load of crap like last time. You just don't have to read that. And as I said before, I mean, you don't even like good reviews, actually. It's best never to read about yourself, and a lot of people will say that within any of the performing professions, because if you don't like you, you feel upset. And if they do like you, they seem to like you for all the wrong reasons, or you don't, you know, they pick up on the wrong points or something. So much simpler not to read it.
Well, the opening of Watcher in the Skies.
Watcher in the Skies. Very strong atmosphere. It was better live than it ever was on the record. And the funny thing about that was, of course, when we made the record Foxtrot, when we actually played this already live, and we had an engineer who Charisma had brought in, they wanted to make us a bit more sort of earthy, a guy called Bob Potter. And the first thing he said was, oh, I'd like that, but you can't use that. It just sounds like you're trying to do 2001, you know, it's crap. And I thought, well, no, but stage-wise, this has been going down incredibly well, so we couldn't do that. So anyhow, we parted company with this guy after a week or so. He was the one, he was the first one. He said, look, we're not right for each other. And he dead right, he wasn't right for us and all the rest of it. But anyhow, that was by the by. So it was a very important piece at the time. So it was, you know, that was very exciting, really. And Peter was able, therefore, to carry on this kind of weirdness, surreal quality throughout the show, you know, by doing zany things like putting on that flower mask, which became obviously a sort of iconic thing in early Genesis, telling the stories, and all the rest of it. And I think, you know, there's two tours we did on Foxtrot and Selling Them by the Pound were probably the two best tours in many ways. The paraphernalia hadn't got too big, and it just, you know, the songs were sort of, I think, combination of what Peter was doing and what we were doing was worked really well.
You've talked about you're not a huge fan of Lamb, really, at this point.
Well, not as a totality. I think some great songs on it. But
can you tell us a little bit about how was this Peter's grand concept, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway?
Well, the lyrics came afterwards. You know, we'd had most of the music was written, which meant that he probably wrote a bit less music than he might have done. I don't know, it's a rather sort of dark period. I remember we were writing this stuff, we came to it with all the sort of usual kind of way. We'd written bits and pieces and stuff and presented to the group, and some bits we'd use, some bits we wouldn't, and then we developed bits in the thing. We'd written, I suppose, about 80-90% of the music, and then Peter got this phone call from William Friedkin about writing a film script, and he said, oh, I'm going to leave, you know. So it was a kind of weird time. He was not really with the group anymore in many ways, I think. So it was not a good feeling, really. And then, you know, he was persuaded to come back, and we finished the album and obviously left in the subsequent tour, but it was not the same. I mean, Peter and I had been, you know, very close friends at school and then afterwards and stuff, always been like that at each other, having said that, but we were very close. And that, you know, the Lamb tour was kind of difficult for me. I felt we weren't getting on like we used to. It was just odd, and I never felt the show really worked very well. I mean, it was visually, it had lots of exciting moments in it, but we had to play all these songs that didn't really work. I mean, I talked before about piano live was a problem. I used, you know, I had to play all these things I played on acoustic piano. In fact, by the very piano you see behind you, actually, using the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, it's in shot. And so I was playing things like, obviously, the Lamb and the Lamia and Anyway, all these things that were quite pianistic pieces. And trying to play them on electric piano. And it just wasn't great fun. I didn't really enjoy it. I would never have played them live. Well, I played the Lamb itself was okay, but never played the Lamia live. It just was totally wrong. And it was frustrating to do this. And also we had played the double album. Didn't really end as strong as it began. You came off stage, and it was only really through the encore, which used to do Musical Box and a bit of Watcher or something, I think. We had a Musical Box, which was such light relief, you know, by comparison, really. And no, it wasn't my favourite time of the group, really. I mean, I think the album, still like the album a lot, but, you know, it has, to me, more faults than the others, the story being the main fault. I don't think it really works. And just, perhaps it is, you know, I'm sure a lot of people would agree with me, it's too long. It could have been a much better single album.
To what extent was it, you know, this is obviously it's a concept album, you know, and a lot of those had been produced by then. I wonder whether it had come in on the sort of tail end of the idea of the concept album.
Well, I don't think there was anything wrong with the idea of a concept album. I mean, you know, it was logical for us to do this. We'd done Supper's Ready, which was one side of an album, you know, as a concept, and that had worked well. No, I think we were all in favour of the concept album at the time. It wasn't a dirty word at that point, and I think for a lot of our audience, it was exactly what they wanted from us, actually. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with the concept, and it's just I didn't think the actual story really was very moving. You know, I could have done something with a little bit more kind of, you know, we have a romantic side to us, and it didn't use any of that, whereas Last Supper's Ready had. This didn't do that. It had none of that. It was quite of dark and quite sort of street orientated all the way through, really. And when it got quite surreal at times, and a lot of rather surreal lyrics on some quite pretty songs. So it was a slight unhappy marriage at times, I think.
I mean,
having said that, some great lyrics on it. I mean, I love some of the lyrics, you know, but it's just the way it hangs together.
I think one of the things that's striking, obviously, is that we talked about the Englishness and the English, you know, and you say romanticism. Now here you have an American setting, and you know.
Well, it was a very conscious decision by Peter to do that, to try and get that sort of American thing in it. And I think that actually, from that point of view, it works okay. I don't think actually that's too bad. I think that sort of trying to change this perspective a bit from what we've done in the past was quite good. And the album come across as sort of very much sort of, it's got a sort of black and blue quality about it, you know, as opposed to the greens and yellows of the previous albums. And I think that's sort of, you know, I'm quite in favour of all that, really. And I think, you know, where it really works, and a song like Back in New York City, which I think is a great vocal performance from Pete, you know, is really good. And there's lots of other little pieces on there which I think work really well. But yeah, I don't want to be too down on the album. I like it a lot, you know, but it's just not my favourite. I prefer the two albums that came before. I think they are better.
Where do you think Peter's kind of sorry, that's no good. Where do you think Peter's sort of great qualities lie? Is it in these kind of ideas of the staging and so on, the lyric writing, or his vocal qualities? I mean, where does it lie best?
Well, a lot of these things. I mean, I've always loved his voice. You know, I think it's a fantastic voice. It's not terribly versatile voice, but when it sings what it can sing, it sounds fantastic, I think. And you know, and when I was even at school, we used to play things like "Change Gonna Come," you know, Sam Cooke's song done by Otis Redding, and it just, you know, it sends shivers down my spine just hearing him sing it, because he could do it, you know. And then we'd do Nina Simone, or we'd do various bits and pieces where he'd sing with this kind of thing. So whenever I hear his voice now, I'm not hearing just Peter, I'm hearing my whole past in a way, and it still has that effect on me. I think it's a fantastic voice. In terms of his contribution, well, he's original, very original as a music writer as well as a lyric writer, I think. Certainly the staging, he had a lot of, in the early days, he was probably the main motive force to us trying to do something other than, although, you know, it did come a bit from everybody, that, but his own, what he did was very much him, obviously, and that was a key part of it, really. He's always got a great sense of, you know, of rhythmic possibilities. As I said before, he's got that. He can't do it himself. Sometimes he thinks he can, but he can't. When he actually picks up drumsticks and plays drums, he's not very good at keeping time, but he really knows that, and you know, really proved on some of those albums. I mean, you know, of all the solo albums done by anybody, I mean, Peter's my favourite. I can't deny that. The third and fourth albums in particular, I think, are fantastic. And he just, you know, the combination of his voice with the rhythmic ideas and sounds, you know, he's just it's original, very distinctive. The only thing I would regret with Peter, as a writer, he's become more streamlined, you know, in terms of what he's prepared to do harmonically is a lot less. You know, he tends to, but what he does with the more limited palette, I think, is very, very good. So that's good enough for it, isn't it?
And so Peter announcing that he was going to leave, did that seem like the end?
Well, Yeah, well, we sort of had so much preparation for it, really. He'd sort of half left during the album, then he left during the tour. And we carried on finishing the tour with him. And the end of that tour was pretty depressing. We actually cancelled the last show due to lack of interest. And the penultimate show we played in Besançon in France, and the audience, it didn't go down very well or anything. And it was, you know, sort of pretty much a very depressing moment, really. So him leaving, it sort of almost felt, well, we got a chance of perhaps doing something different. I think we desperately wanted to prove that we could do something without him. You know, the group had become so much synonymous with Peter by the time The Lamb came out. It was a bit depressing for all the rest of us because we wanted to sort of say, well, you know, we actually do this stuff, you know. But we knew there were insurmountable problems. But we tried to just not to face them, really. We decided we'd try and write some stuff and at the same time as looking for a singer.
Just carry on.
Just carry on, see what happens, you know. And once we got some music we thought was really good, then we looked for a singer. We tried singers, and that didn't really work, as has been, you know, obviously said many times. And then obviously, you know, Phil was there, you know, and whether he had the range, we didn't really know he had the range. He had a lovely sort of choir boy voice, you know, a soft voice, you know, James Taylorish type voice. But whether he could do something else.
That sort of soul sound.
That took time to come too, I think. He tried very hard and he sang aggressively on something like Squonk, and he carries it off pretty well, but he's not totally convincing in that role, I don't think. But we're able to use other sides of him, his sort of quirkiness. He's, you know, when something like the melody of the vocal, on Robbie Sultan Battery, where he's able to do it in his kind of cheeky sort of cockney chappy accent and stuff, and which gave us another sort of thing we could do. So he developed ways of being able to do stuff. And obviously, by the time we got to the 1980s, he developed this sort of way of singing hard that was really good as well. So it was, but at the beginning, it wasn't obvious. And it wasn't obvious that he was going to want to do it live, because he was such a drummer. He just loved drumming, you know. I thought, he's never going to want to sing, you know. And it was, in the end, he said, well, why don't I do it? He said, I like the drums, you know. I said, well, you know. And we're very lucky in that first tour to get Bill Bruford, you know, to work with us as someone he respected, also, you know, a really good drummer. And that sort of helped us through that, to tide us over that first tour, I think. Bill himself was very popular in America through his work with Yes and stuff. So he was actually a bit of, you know, he was certainly a rung above the rest of us, actually. So he was quite helpful from that point of view. And so the audiences came, and you know, once Phil got used to the idea of being a singer, he just developed his own personality and obviously became, well, we know what he became.
I'm going to stop you there.
Okay, please do.
Actually, there is one thing I'd like to do. When you refer to the piano behind you, when you
Yeah.
said, that very piano,
Yeah.
I was kind of on the wrong side shot for this. So I was wondering if we could.
Well, it's very difficult to do things. You'll have to ask me the question again.
Well, yeah, I was just wondering.
It'll look so contrived when the very piano.
No, yeah. Well, indeed. That's kind of not what I'm asking for.
All right.
It'd be nice if there was maybe another spin on the question that you could.
Spin on the question. Okay. Are we running?
We are.
Okay. Okay. So you were talking about Lamb and you know, having to play the electronic keyboard as opposed to the piano. So, but the piano was the thing that really kind of was the sound of the album when you recorded it and wrote it.
Well, for certain songs, the piano was a very important aspect. Obviously, other parts were done on organ and stuff, so it wasn't a problem. But kind of for the songs, particularly the song Lamb, was done on Broadway, the Lamia, and Anyway. I could think of three, probably many others, which were played on the piano you can see in the background behind you there. And it's also used on Trick of the Tail, by the way, actually, that particular record. Because the one we had on Trick of the Tail, it had in the studio at Trident, had been specially sort of doctored for Elton John, apparently. So it had no touch. You hit it and it went bang like that. And I was trying to play Madman Moon on it, which is a kind of soft, kind of pseudo-classical kind of piece, and I couldn't do it at all. So the poor roadies had to take this thing down into Trident Studios, which was a hole in the ground off Wardour Street, you know. And anyhow, there you go. So that was used then as well.
Just keep running on this. So in that video of you guys, Trick of the Tail, where are you standing all round the piano?
Well, I'm sitting at it, playing it.
Is that the one?
No, it's an upright piano. If you look again, you will see that, because Phil had to dance up and down the keys, if you remember.
That's right.
He's small, but not that small.
It was all getting more difficult, and I think, you know, as the tensions built, people were hanging on tighter and making the rules tighter, and so the urge to break out. And then with the personal stuff, when for me there was very little sympathy and support, when, you know, I was seriously facing losing a child, that I think was the icing on the cake that sort of closed the door.
I have to say that I didn't, you know, I mean, I didn't know. I mean,
I wasn't aware of it either. I had my own problems because my marriage had broken up.
No, you know.
Yeah.
Terrible. But real terrible.
Yeah.
We're either bad talkers or bad listeners.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we kind of thought of it as being that much in the forefront. Yes, we're certainly, well, that's part of our upbringing. I think it doesn't help. But I think, just coming back to the writing thing, you've got 5 people writing in a group, and you've got a record coming out maybe once a year or something. There just wasn't enough space. You know, it's a tiny amount of music. So it had to shed somebody, and Peter was the obvious person to go because he had a career he could go to.